Welcome to the Business of Apparel podcast. This is the place to learn how to start and scale your own apparel brand and fill it with loyal customers for years to come. I'm your host, Rachel Erickson, owner and CEO of Unmarked Street, and I can't wait to share this episode with you. Welcome back to the Business of Apparel podcast. Today, I have with me someone that I know you are going to want to meet and hear a lot from. Cheryl Tzeng is coming to us from Short Street Company, and she is a sourcing expert. Now, at the Business of Apparel, and especially in our consulting side at Unmarked Street, we get a lot of questions about sourcing. And so, Cheryl, thank you so much for being here with me today. I'm really, really excited to pick your brain on all of this.
I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's jump right in. I think I really want to know, just kind of off the bat, like for someone just starting out or maybe has no experience with manufacturing or sourcing in the fashion world, what are the most important things that they need to know about finding the right factory?
There's a lot of things
There are a lot
you
of
need
things,
to consider, right? But I think the top three things that I can think of, one, your factory capabilities. So depending on what type of product you're making, it makes a huge difference. If you're making knits versus wovens, women's versus men's, tops versus bottoms, just knowing that the factories that you're looking at have those capabilities. There are a lot of big factories that have multiple setups. They can do knits, they can do wovens. It's important to find out what percentage of knits or wovens or technical outerwear or yoga leggings they're making to make sure it's in line with the type of product you're making, because you want to make sure you have those skilled workers that can actually execute, rather than we kind of dabble in that area and, we'll do the best to cobble something together for you. So factory capabilities are really important. Size.
Yeah.
That's a really big thing that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about. They get a reference from somebody else in the industry and they're like, this is great. They can do all the product. But if you are a really big brand, you're used to doing hundreds of thousands of units, millions of units, versus you're just starting out and you have maybe 500 units if you're lucky, that's probably not the best match for you. They are probably really well certified. They have skilled workers. They can do everything. However, if they're telling you that you need a 3,000 minimum or 1,000 minimum, and you really can only do a couple of hundred, and then you end up sitting on inventory for 2 years.
Yeah.
For your business.
Yes.
So size matters, asking what their capacity is, what their output. A really big indication is MOQs. Are they saying MOQs are going to be 300 units or 800 units or 3,000 units? So that's a really big indication of what level they are in terms of their capacity and their size. Another really big thing for me is partnership.
Yes, I love that.
A good partner. And that really also just depends on how you connect with whoever is representing that factory, how long they've been working with that factory. Are they brand new and are they just selling a service, or have they been with them for 10, 15 years and they really feel passionate about this? There are so many things that you can't predict, right?
Yeah.
If something happens with shipping and freight forwarding and, your lead times are messed up, how is your factory going to help you get your product to where it needs to go? And there's a lot of hand-holding and negotiation, but you want to be able to talk to them candidly. You want to be able to ask for some of those favors, and you want to be able to offer those things back to them. So a factory that's willing to work with you when things are a little bit out of whack is really, really important. And I think that just comes from having those conversations and building those relationships. So that's a really important thing.
I think it's so important to come at that too from a sense of like understanding and kindness and empathy.
Exactly.
And we hear a lot from like people coming to us that my factory keeps messing everything up and they're really blowing it over there. And when we really dig in deep to what's going on, we realize that, it's actually not the factory. It's that your processes probably could have been buttoned up or the communication could have been better from your side. And so I think, to your point, building that partnership from a point of like understanding, openness, kindness, and empathy, and like really making sure that you're going back and forth. It's a two-way street. I love that point. It's so good.
Yeah, I mean, I always say as much as you are the customer and they're offering you a service, you still have to have that mutual respect and the
Yes.
compassion. They are still people working on your product. And at the end of the day, if they decide that they don't want to work with you and pull production right in the middle of a season, then you don't have any product. So they're
Right.
they're a partner. They're not just
Yep.
a service.
Yes.
Something else that I will throw out there to think about is the importance of your country of origin, just because that kind of maybe ties into marketing or storytelling, even just like things to consider, like your tariffs and duties, like how much are
Yep.
you willing to pay? Because depending on where it's from, whether it's coming from a free trade zone or whether it's coming from somewhere in Asia, that's really important. I
Yep.
think some people don't consider that. And then when they get slapped with like 34% duties, it's a
Yes.
shock,
Yeah.
and it really makes your cost of goods go up. So just something to also just keep in the periphery when you're thinking about where you want to manufacture.
Yeah, definitely. We've been getting a lot of questions on that, especially recently. And I think next week, actually, I'm going to try to do an episode just on tariffs and kind of give some information on what I
Mm,
know about that area. But
yeah,
that is a huge one. It adds a lot of money to your bottom
it
line if you're not prepared
really
for it.
does. Yeah. 16% versus 34% versus 0%. Huge difference.
Huge difference. Yeah. Can you kind of continue expanding? I'd love for you to also speak about the importance that you find in checking on like a factory's sustainability. How do you kind of maybe get that information for them, or what are you looking for if you want to be partnering with a sustainable factory or manufacturer?
Yeah. So I think it really starts from you.
Mm,
How far do you want to go? How sustainable or how much social responsibility matters to you? And I think it matters to a lot of people
yeah.
these days. And I think the great thing is a lot of factory partners are on board with that. A lot of factories will have, they'll send you their profile, right? So all of the information, MOQs, lead times, how many production lines they have, and then they talk about certifications and, what their green initiatives are. There are a lot of things out there that you can do. One is obviously just your materials alone are sustainable. So you need a supplier that does that. If you're talking about a factory, I mean, there are factories that use solar power, there are factories that do wastewater irrigation. They have a lot of innovative things depending on what region they're coming from. So I think a lot of it stems from you and how far you want to go, how much it matters to you and to your product in terms of, the footprint that you're leaving behind.
Yeah.
There are definitely factories out there that try to do it soup to nuts. I mean, it's really, really hard in our industry. There is a lot of waste, there's a lot of pollution,
Yep.
but there are things that you can do all along the way. So it's not just your material, it's not just your hang tag and a biodegradable poly bag.
Right.
It is also how your factory partners are trying to make a difference. A really easy thing to look out for is just your certifications.
Hmm.
So, specific certifications that will already indicate, like, hey, they are complying with all of these things that help to make the process a little bit greener. So, if that's not a lot of research you want to do, start to look for the certifications. And a lot of factories will have those readily available. They're all jumping on board. So, it's a good thing.
That's great. And do you still find that Blue Sign tends to be like the top of the top on certifications?
I believe so. I mean, I feel like they're one of the first and they have pretty stringent standards.
Yeah.
So I think that's still a good one. Obviously, you have GOTS,
Mhm.
and that's a really big one with a lot of the factories too. But again, really just depends on how far you want to go, and what matters, because there's also, I want to mention the social responsibility aspect. Are they paying their
Yes.
workers fair wages, or are
Yeah.
they doing better than fair wages? Are they involved in the community where they are seeking skilled workers and artisans from a specific region, from a specific village, because they're trying to build up that community? So all
Yeah.
of those things are important as well.
Yeah. And I tend to find that if you ask for that information right up front, like even if you're just going out and looking for your first few manufacturers or whatever it is, they're very, very proud to provide
Yeah.
that information.
Yeah.
And a lot of them will have like a vendor manual or some sort of
Mhm.
booklet that even shows pictures of all the different things that they're doing. And so asking for that information is usually actually very easy to get back from your different choices if you're interviewing different people. So if you're listening today and you're worried about that, don't hesitate to ask, because usually they're very excited to share how compliant they are. It's a big deal.
Yeah, and also if they're not on board because they are maybe a smaller factory, I found that a lot of them are very willing to go that extra mile to get the certification because it helps them too.
Yeah,
So, if you ask for it and they don't have it, find out if they're willing to maybe get a specific type of certification that you can get a quality assurance company in there. You can split
yeah,
the cost with them, so I wouldn't discount a factory that doesn't already have it. I would just start the conversation.
I love that. It's so good. And I think that's a great segue kind of into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is you kind of mentioned splitting costs. And I think there are so many things that a lot of new people starting apparel brands today don't realize that you can put into a vendor contract, and you can put like pen to paper, and you can put a bunch of different things into this document that says this is how we are going to be partners once you
Mhm.
decide to sign on with somebody. And so I'm really curious, I talk a lot about negotiating costs with factories and how that's a really big thing that you need to be able to do within that partnership. But what are some other key things that you would recommend people look at if they're starting to build a contract, or if they want to negotiate kind of a partnership with a new
Mhm.
manufacturer or factory?
I think some of the big things that really affect the brands, especially smaller brands, are your lead times and your MOQs. Your MOQs are
Yes.
such a big thing. And it can be, negotiating down from 800 to 750. That might not seem like a lot, but if your product is really expensive in terms of
Mhm.
the cost of making it FOB, that is hundreds or thousands of dollars. If
Yes.
they're not willing to go down by 100 or 200, and then, being able to negotiate your color minimums, right? Like, here's your MOQ, here's your MCQ. What can we do? And then throwing out options, throwing out scenarios like, if I'm using stock available fabric, if we do vendor source, if we work with your partner suppliers, you know,
Yes.
what what is the benefit? Because working with their partner suppliers, much easier for them typically than working with
Yeah.
nominated suppliers. So those are all things to consider. They seem small, but they matter to your bottom line, and then they matter to kind of your longevity with the partnership. So I would say MOQs and MCQs are like a really big one to think about. And again, it could be season to season. So it might not be your first off season or a big contract. You could sign on and
Exactly.
say, yes, I will do 1,000 units or I will do 800 units. But as you build that relationship, don't be afraid to ask, like, hey, we've already made these many units with you for these many years. Can we, if we're struggling a little bit this season, are you okay to do 600 instead of
Yeah.
800? And we're going to try to make it up next season. We can do fewer colors so that it's more efficient for the factory. So those are, I think, the really big things. Lead times are a little bit more challenging because obviously it takes a certain number of days to weave a fabric or knit a fabric or dye
Yep.
it, but you can negotiate on, even your standards that you lay
Mm.
out in the beginning. So can we skip PPS? And you can just send me a TOP for reference because you've already done this style or you've done a similar style. You know what the factory capabilities are. So those are things where I think there's a little bit more flexibility and you can pivot depending on what the situation is with you. But again, going back to that partnership is
Yeah.
really important because that's where you need the flexibility. And when you have a good partner, they're typically more than willing to say, yes, I can make an exception.
Yeah, I love that. And I want to go back just a minute what you were saying about like nominated suppliers versus working with their like factory source suppliers. And so when
Mhm.
we're talking about that, we're talking about like if you're working with a factory and they really prefer to provide zippers from a different manufacturer than you might nominate within your own bill of materials, a lot of times that helps them because it's building their relationship with someone that they've been building a relationship with. But also it can really help you because instead of having to provide all of that information to them, you can rely on that partnership. You can rely on your factory to help you
Yeah.
source and nominate trims or packaging or fabrics, sometimes even that will be maybe more cost efficient for you and your brand,
Yeah.
easier to source, faster to get to the factory. There's a lot of advantages there to really using factory source materials. And I don't think enough people realize that that's an option available to them.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not always the best option. I think you have to kind of like weigh the pros and cons.
Yes.
If you are manufacturing in different regions, different countries, but you want and you need your brand consistency, your product packaging consistency, your trim package consistency, that's when maybe a nominated supplier is a little bit easier because you have one supplier, they can supply to the different regions. That's
Yeah.
great. You don't have to worry about quality. However, it doesn't mean that you can't go vendor sourced because if you have the resources and the time to make sure that as you are counter developing, quality is the same across the board or close enough, it
Yes.
maintains your brand integrity, that's a great thing. So I think, you have to obviously figure out, do you have the resources and the time to sit there and make sure your hang tag looks the same? It's the same thickness, it's the same texture, it's the same color. Because yes, vendor source has a lot of benefits. It's usually faster, it's usually a little bit more affordable, and that affects your bottom line.
Yes.
So, a lot of pros and cons. If you're a bigger company, usually nominated suppliers are great because
Yeah.
then again, you just don't have to worry about it. It's just one source that you're going to if you have any questions, if you have any changes. So that's a really, really good thing. You just pay the premium for that.
Yeah. That's such a good point. And you're absolutely right. I think there are definitely nuances to both of those different sides, and
Mhm.
every brand is going to have a different answer for themselves. I think that's a really great point.
Yeah.
Can you continue to kind of expand on that and talk a little bit about a lot of the other things that we want to consider when we're considering working with a factory? Like, what is it like before and after production? How do we check with them for like PO accuracy and
Mhm.
quality and things like that? Like, what are those kinds of elements? And are there some things that we could put into maybe a vendor contract that help us make sure if we don't get the quality or we don't get the accuracy that we expected, what can we do in those situations?
Production planning, I suppose you would
Yes.
call
Yeah.
it. There's so many things going into it. Then you have the production part where you have, you're completely hands off, you're doing what they do, and then you come back in and, whether you're checking for quality, you are arranging freight forwarder information, all of that stuff. It's a lot. But
Yes.
I think one of the big things is having an SLA, service level agreement, right? So
Yep.
if that is something you write into a contract or if that is just something that you provide to your vendor, I think that's really important to set the precedence and to
Yes.
be able to say, like, these are all of the things that we expect. And it's not unreasonable. And I think a lot of people sometimes are afraid to say, these are our standards, these are our
Yeah.
expectations, because they are used to having SLAs in place. It helps them. It really, really helps them. If you don't have a third party QA company, if you don't have boots on the ground where they're going to go through the TOPs or just the production lines, making sure that everything is done to the approved standard, then you rely on the factory to do that.
Yeah.
So that's where it is important to say, I expect 10% to be audited, or you have to audit at this phase and this phase and this phase. So writing all of those things into an SLA is really helpful for yourself because then you can hold them accountable to it and they
Yes.
can hold themselves accountable to it. And obviously, if there is a quality issue, you're able to say, okay, this is going to affect my sales by this amount because of whatever reason. If it's a completely malfunctioning zipper, that's
Hmm.
not acceptable, right?
Right.
And that means they have to redo everything. That's going to delay shipment. How much is that going to affect your sales? And then you're more able to easily calculate like what you need to charge back, what is going to be the difference. because you can't let those things affect your sales at the end of the day.
Right.
So that is something to consider. It feels very far away from when you're selling through and you are calculating, what is your profit margin? What is your cost of goods? So I think having an SLA in place is important. It doesn't have to be really complicated. It could be 10 points to begin with, but being able to provide that and say, like, these are the things that I need your help with in terms of checking for quality. These are the things that need to be done when it's handed over to the freight forwarder. Those things are really, really important. You mentioned PO accuracy. I
Mm.
think a lot of that is 100% on you. You
Yep.
have to make sure your style numbers are right. You have to make sure your color codes are right, your SKUs. So there's one thing with PO accuracy, but then when you are submitting your barcodes, your
Yep.
barcode labels, you have to make sure that's right. You have to do the job. A lot of times your factory partner will also just double check. And when they print out those barcodes, they typically scan it and they'll be like, hey, it's not scanning.
Yeah.
But you want to try to mitigate that as much as possible. So have a template, have those things already set up and in place so that when you are sending a PO, you're literally importing it from whatever Excel file or Google Sheets file that you've been working on. Make it as seamless and streamlined as possible. It will save you like a ton of a
Yeah.
headache,
Yeah.
if things sort of get lost in communication. So you just, again, just the templates, just the SLAs, I think those are really helpful tools.
Yeah, I remember it feels like a lifetime ago. I think in my job, like 12 years ago, we used to have these like scanners at our desks as
Right.
developers. And my factory would send me, okay, here's what printed out when we got your UPC codes and we printed
Yeah,
out your barcode stickers. Can you double check them and make sure that everything is going into your system properly? And so I would sit there for like afternoons and just scan like a
yeah,
bazillion barcodes to make sure that they were
yeah,
actually going to work, but
right.
it guaranteed that we were getting exactly what we needed. And so, to your
Exactly.
point, sometimes it just requires a lot of work on your side too to make sure
Yeah.
that it's going to be accurate.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that too is just, again, planning, right? It's
Yeah.
that word production planning, having a calendar and following it, because then okay, I've submitted my PO. A week from now, I have to submit my UPCs, my barcode stickers, my barcodes. And then you can calculate, okay, when they start printing it,
Mhm.
close to the end of production, I need to allocate maybe half a day
Yeah.
to scan all of these things. So you can plan for those things so that it's not like a big shock when it comes along. It's like, oh my gosh, I don't have half a day to do all of this, but I need to
Right.
get it done. And then you're, working late into the night. So being able to plan those things as steps in the whole process, I think is going to be very helpful for yourself.
Yeah. I love that. It's so good. I want to touch on too. So, one big question that we also get about sourcing a lot is you talked about it a little bit, like regions of the world. Like, are there good regions to go to? Are there bad regions to go to? And I know I have my answer on this, but
Yeah,
I'd love to get your very expert opinion on the answer to that question.
that's a loaded question.
It is a loaded question.
What I will say, I think, is that one, it depends on your product, right? So I
Yeah.
think if you're doing activewear technical product, typically a lot of the raw materials, so your moisture wicking, four-way stretch, nylon, spandex materials and fabrics, typically those are coming from Asia.
Yep.
So there are a lot of mills in like Taiwan,
Mhm.
China, Vietnam. That's typically where those things are being made. If you're looking at cotton t-shirts, tri-blends, those are being made worldwide. There's
Yep.
different regions for that. So I don't think there's like a cut and dry answer. I think it depends on your product type, your product category. I think in Asia, they are very much set up for huge mass production.
Yes.
If you're looking at areas in South America, Central America, there are a lot more bespoke mom and pop sort of setups, which are sometimes really good if you're a small brand with storytelling. They provide the raw materials, they spin the yarns, they have a family of sewers that have been working with the company for decades and they make everything from scratch. And
Yeah.
it's a longer process, but that's a really great process as well. And it's really good storytelling, again, depending on your product.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say there's a good region or a bad region. I think a good manufacturer delivers at every stage, on every level. And I think the same can be said about a brand or a customer to that manufacturer as well. So yeah, I think it's really, does the manufacturer deliver to your standards, to your expectations? And if they're not delivering and you've had conversations with them, then that is not a good manufacturer. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter what region they're from. They could be making yoga leggings and they have like the best four-way stretch. They have all of those good things. But if they're not delivering on time, if you're finding
Mhm.
loose threads, things are not to spec, that is not a good manufacturer.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree. And I also love to tell people, like, I have seen amazing factories and terrible factories in all different regions. So
Yeah,
it's not to say that one country is actually better or worse than another. It really does depend on the product and the actual factory itself. So
right. Yeah,
I love that. It's such good
100%.
advice. Yeah. So Cheryl, tell us, if someone is looking for sourcing help, how do they find you? How do they find Short Street Company? Where can they follow you?
I guess you can just follow me on LinkedIn.
Perfect.
Yeah, just follow me on LinkedIn. I'm just me, small right now, but I love working with smaller brands and businesses who are just starting out or who are really struggling. I've worked with a number of people who, like you said at the beginning, it's just like, I can't work with this factory. Like, they're not delivering. My samples are looking terrible. And a lot of times it is just like little fixes in
Yeah.
between. It's like, let's take a look at your tech pack. Some people are like, I need a pattern maker. And it's like, no, not really.
Right.
Maybe you just need a tech designer. And
Right.
let's take a look at what your tech pack looks like. Let's take a look at your sketch. A lot of people sketch with stylized silhouettes. And you're like, no, no, no. It needs
Yeah.
to
No,
be
it needs to be technically
technical.
accurate.
It's not sexy, but
Right.
it needs to be accurate.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of like those kinds of little things that it's not always the factory. It's not always the source or the manufacturing. It's really just little tools, little processes that just need to change. And it really makes a big difference.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for lending your expertise today and sharing all that you have. This was so fantastic. If you liked this episode, please leave us a review, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much for listening to the Business of Apparel podcast. I would so appreciate hearing your thoughts on the show. And if you know someone who could benefit from it, please share it with them. My biggest desire is to help other apparel professionals understand the nuances of our industry so we can all work toward making better product for a better world. If you would like to connect further, I'd love to invite you to send me a message through my website, thebusinessofapparel.com, where I do weekly trainings through my YouTube video channel, a weekly newsletter, blog articles, and so many more resources to help you start and scale a profitable apparel brand. This podcast is produced by Box 7 Media, who I cannot speak highly enough of. If you're looking to start your own podcast, you can reach out to Jeremy at Box 7 Media on LinkedIn anytime.